The playground, where shadows come to life. The night was alive with the kind of silence that wasn't natural. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted through the overgrown park, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each step. The air felt thicker here, pressing against her skin like a living thing, and the distant creak of the swings echoed unnervingly in her ears. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. Something was behind her, something that didn't belong in the world. She understood. Don't stop. Keep moving, she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Her sneakers pounded against the cracked pavement, scattering loose gravel as she raced toward the playground. She didn't want to come here. God, no. But she had no choice. Not after what she'd seen. The swings came into view first, swaying violently, as if caught in an invisible storm. Behind them, the decaying merry-go-round spun in slow, lazy circles, its rusted metal groaning like a wounded animal. Clara skidded to a halt, her chest heaving. She turned off her flashlight and crouched low behind a pile of rotting wooden planks that had once been part of the jungle gym. She needed to think, to breathe. A low, guttural sound broke the silence, a scraping, dragging noise, like nails on concrete. Clara's stomach churned as she pressed herself tighter against the planks. She didn't know how it had started. Not exactly. One moment, she was walking through the woods near her house, searching for her lost dog, Milo. She shook her head, biting back the scream, clawing its way up her throat. She couldn't afford to lose it now. Her fingers tightened around the flashlight, the cold metal grounding her, reminding her she wasn't powerless. Just get to the other side, she muttered under her breath. The car was parked just beyond the playground. If she could make it there, she might still have a chance. The scraping sound stopped. Clara froze, her ears straining against the unnatural stillness. For a moment, all she could hear was the thundering of her own heartbeat. Then, a child's voice cut through the air, soft and melodic, like a lullaby. Come play with us. The words sent icy tendrils snaking down her spine. Slowly, she turned her head toward the swings. A figure stood there, a child, no more than 7 or 8, silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. The boy wore a faded red hoodie, the fabric frayed and torn at the edges. His face was hidden in shadow, but Clara could feel his eyes on her, watching, waiting. Milo, she whispered, her voice cracking. The boy tilted his head, a slow, unnatural movement that made Clara's stomach lurch. No, the child said, his voice layered with something darker, something older. But you can join him. Before she could react, the boy's shadow stretched unnaturally, spreading across the ground like a pool of ink. It slithered toward her, faster than it should have been possible. Clara screamed, stumbling backward, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam flickered, casting jagged, disjointed shadows across the playground. The boy was gone. A week ago, Clara had found the flyer tucked into her mailbox. It was simple, just a piece of cheap paper with a crude drawing of a playground scrawled in black marker. Beneath the image, a single sentence was written in bold, uneven letters. Come play after dark. She'd laughed it off at first, assuming it was some kind of prank. Black Hollow wasn't the kind of town where strange things happened. Sure, there were the usual urban legends, the haunted school, the ghost on Main Street, but those were just stories kids told to scare each other. This? This felt off. She'd crumpled up the flyer and tossed it into the trash. That night, Milo disappeared. He'd been whining at the back door, scratching to go outside like he always did before. Bed, Clara had let him out, expecting him to come trotting back a few minutes later. But he never did. She'd called his name, searching the yard with a flashlight, but there was no sign of him. The woods behind her house were dark and silent, swallowing her voice like a black hole. The next morning, the flyer was back. It was pinned to her front door this time, fluttering in the breeze. The message had changed. He's waiting. The memory faded as Clara forced herself to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline pushed her forward. She snatched up the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. "I'm not going to die here," she growled, her voice trembling. "Not like this." The merry-go-round screeched as it spun faster, the sound sharp and grating. Clara glanced over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The shadows were moving again, detaching themselves from the jungle gym, slide, and sandbox. They twisted and writhed like living things, their edges flickering like flames. The boy's voice echoed in her head, taunting her. "Come play." Clara bolted. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she sprinted toward the parking lot. Her car was just ahead, a dark silhouette against the moonlit trees. Relief surged through her, giving her an extra burst of speed. She fumbled with her keys as she reached the driver's side door, her hands trembling so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock. Behind her, the shadows screamed. It wasn't a human sound. It was something raw and guttural, a sound that scraped against her mind like nails on a chalkboard. She didn't dare look back. The door unlocked with a satisfying click, and Clara threw herself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind her. The shadows surged forward, slamming into the car with a force that rocked it on its tires. Clara screamed, jamming the key into the ignition and twisting it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "Come on," she shouted, slamming her palm against the steering wheel. The shadows were clawing at the windows now, their inky forms pressing against the glass. The boy's face appeared on the other side, grinning with too many teeth. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice muffled but clear. Clara turned the key again, and this time, the engine roared to life. She floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as the headlights cut through them like a blade. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, the playground long behind her. Only then did she pull over, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The flyer was on the passenger seat. This time, it read, "See you soon." Clara didn't want to go back, but the nightmares left her no choice. Every night, she saw the playground. The rusted swings swayed in a windless night. The shadows danced across the merry-go-round, creeping closer with every dream. And Milo was always there, just out of reach, barking, howling, and fading into the darkness when she called his name. On the third night, she woke up with the taste of blood in her mouth. She'd bitten her lip in her sleep. Her body trembled, her sheets soaked in sweat. The air in her room felt thick, suffocating, like the shadows from the playground had followed her home. Clara swung her legs over the side of the bed, gripping her temples as if she could physically hold herself together. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Milo was out there. He had to be. The drive back, the road to the playground felt different at night. By day, the narrow path through the woods was unremarkable, a simple dirt trail leading to the remnants of a long-abandoned park. But now, under the pale glow of a half-moon, the woods loomed tall and foreboding. The trees seemed closer together, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. Clara's car crawled along the trail, the headlights illuminating the narrow path ahead. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she thought about turning back, but the memory of Milo's wagging tail kept her moving forward. She'd raised him since he was a puppy, and he was more than a dog to her. He was family. When the playground came into view, she parked on the side of the trail and killed the engine. For a moment, she sat in the silence, her breath fogging up the windshield. The swings moved lazily in the breeze, the sound of rusted chains creaking faintly in the distance. Her stomach churned. "You can do this," she whispered, grabbing her flashlight from the passenger seat. The cold metal felt reassuring in her hand, though she doubted it would protect her from whatever was out there. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she approached the playground, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the faint sound of water dripping somewhere nearby added to the oppressive stillness. "Here, Milo," she called, her voice cracking. It echoed back at her, distorted and hollow. She scanned the playground with the flashlight, her heart sinking as the beam revealed nothing but abandoned equipment. The slide was cracked and covered in graffiti. The jungle gym was half collapsed, its once bright paint chipped and faded, and the merry-go-round. Clara froze. The merry-go-round was spinning again, just as it had the night she ran. There was no wind, no reason for it to move, but the rusted metal groaned as it turned in slow, deliberate circles. Her chest tightened as she stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight flickering as if it, too, was afraid. "Milo?" she whispered. The merry-go-round stopped. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she swung the flashlight toward the swings. One of them was occupied. A child sat there, his small hands gripping the chains. He wore the same faded red hoodie, his head bowed so that his face was hidden beneath the shadow of the hood. Clara stepped back, her hand shaking so badly that the flashlight beam wavered. "Who are you?" she demanded. "What do you want?" The boy's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if his neck were a hinge. When he looked up, his face was pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, pits of darkness. "Come play with us," he said, his voice a chilling monotone. Clara stumbled backward, her breath hitching in her throat. The shadows around the playground began to stir, pooling beneath the equipment and stretching toward her like living tendrils. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. The boy rose from the swing, his movements jerky and inhuman. "You came back," he said, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "That means you belong to us now." "No," Clara whispered, forcing her legs to move. "I don't belong here. The shadows surged toward her, and she turned and bolted. She didn't care where she was running. She just needed to get away. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. But she didn't stop to retrieve it. She didn't know how far she'd run before the sound of barking brought her to a halt. Clara spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. "Milo?" she called, her voice cracking with desperation. The barking came again, closer this time. It was unmistakably Milo's bark, but there was something off about it, a hollow, echoing quality that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She followed the sound, her breathing ragged as she pushed through the underbrush. The woods were darker here, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. The barking grew louder, more frantic, and she broke into a sprint, tears streaming down her face. When she emerged into a small clearing, she stopped dead in her tracks. Milo was there, his familiar golden fur matted with dirt. He stood at the edge of the clearing, wagging his tail and barking excitedly. "Milo!" Clara cried, relief flooding through her. She dropped to her knees, holding out her arms. "Come, here, boy." Milo's tail stopped wagging. The air grew colder, and Clara's breath fogged in the moonlight. Milo didn't move. He just stood there, staring at her with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Come on, boy," she urged, her voice trembling. "Let's go home." Milo tilted his head, the motion eerily similar to the boy on the swing. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Clara's relief was short-lived as she realized that his movements were wrong, stiff and unnatural, like a marionette being guided by invisible strings. The shadows were back. They crept into the clearing, slithering along, the ground like smoke. Milo's body convulsed, his limbs jerking as the shadows wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. Clara screamed, scrambling backward as her dog was consumed by the darkness. The shadows coalesced into a single form, a towering figure with elongated limbs and eyes that burned like embers. It loomed over her, its presence suffocating. "You shouldn't have come back," it rumbled, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Clara scrambled to her feet, her instincts screaming at her to run, but the shadows surged forward, engulfing her in darkness. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The world was nothing but cold, suffocating blackness. When Clara opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground just outside the playground. The first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, bathing the area in pale light. Her body ached, her head pounding as she pushed herself up on trembling arms. The playground was silent now, the equipment still and lifeless. There was no sign of the boy, the shadows, or Milo. But as she staggered back to her car, she felt it, that oppressive presence, watching her from the woods. She didn't look back. She couldn't. When she reached the car, a folded piece of paper was tucked beneath the windshield wiper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, the same crude drawing of the playground staring back at her. This time, the message was different. "You're one of us now." Clara sat on her couch, staring at the drawing from the playground. Her hands trembled as she traced the jagged lines of the crude illustration. The note's message, "You're one of us now," replayed in her mind like a broken record. Her apartment, normally her sanctuary, felt oppressive, as though the shadows from the playground had followed her here. She hadn't called anyone, unsure of how to explain what had happened. Who would believe her? A haunted playground, a spectral boy, and living shadows. It sounded insane, but her chest tightened with the unshakable certainty that it was all real. She couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in every corner. Desperation clawed at her. If she didn't act, she might lose her grip on reality entirely. She grabbed her laptop, fingers fumbling as she typed, "Abandoned playground urban legends." The search results were overwhelming. Forums, blog posts, and old news articles painted a chilling picture. The playground she had stumbled upon wasn't just forgotten, it was infamous. 20 years ago, the playground had been the center of a string of mysterious disappearances. 5 children had vanished within 6 months, all last seen playing there. Despite extensive searches, no bodies were ever found. The playground had been closed and fenced off shortly after, but locals still whispered about it. They called it Shadowland. One blog post caught Clara's attention. The playground where shadows play. The author claimed to have visited the site, describing an encounter eerily similar to Clara's. The post mentioned rusted swings that moved on their own, strange noises, and a figure watching from the merry-go-round. The blog ended abruptly, the final words chilling. If you hear your name, don't answer. If you see the shadows, don't run. They like it when you run. Clara's stomach churned. She scrolled further, finding an old police report. The investigation had noted a disturbing detail. The children who disappeared had drawn pictures of the playground in the weeks before they vanished. Their drawings all included the same figure, a shadowy boy on the swing. Clara couldn't sit still. Her mind buzzed with fragments of information, none of which fit together. She needed answers, but where would she even begin? A knock at the door made her jump. She approached cautiously, heart pounding. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar face. Ethan, her neighbor. "Clara? You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice muffled through the door. She hesitated before unlocking it. Ethan stepped in, his brow furrowed with concern. "You've been pacing all day. I heard you screaming last night. What's going on?" Clara hesitated. Could she trust him? He was one of the few people she knew who wouldn't immediately dismiss her as crazy. I think I'm being haunted," she admitted, her voice shaking. She told him everything. The playground, the shadows, Milo, the boy, and the note. Ethan listened, his expression darkening as she spoke. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not crazy," he said. "I've heard stories about that place. My uncle grew up near there. He said people who went to that playground, they didn't come back the same." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "He said the shadows cling to you," Ethan continued. "Once you see them, they never let you go. They follow you, whisper to you, and try to pull you into their world." His words sent a chill down her spine. "But why me? I didn't mean to go there. Her voice broke. "I just wanted to find Milo." Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. "You need to find out what they want before it's too late." Clara and Ethan decided to visit the local library. They spent hours combing through old newspapers and town records, piecing together the playground's dark history. They found mentions of an older tragedy, a fire that had destroyed a nearby orphanage 50 years ago. Many children had died in the blaze, and those who survived were sent to foster homes. But one child was never accounted for, Samuel Grayson, an 8-year-old boy with a troubled past. The more they read, the clearer it became that Samuel might be connected to the playground. Witnesses from that era had claimed to see Samuel's figure near the playground after the fire, always sitting on the swing. Some said he was looking for friends to play with. Others believed he was seeking revenge. Their search led them to a name, Henry Grayson, Samuel's last living relative. Clara tracked him down to a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The house was dark and uninviting, its windows boarded up. Clara knocked on the door, and after a long pause, an elderly man opened it. His face was weathered, his eyes haunted. "I know why you're here," Henry said, before Clara could speak. His voice was low, heavy with regret. "You've seen him, haven't you?" "My nephew," Clara nodded, her throat dry. He's at the playground. I think he's the reason I can't." She stopped, struggling to find the right words. "I just want to understand." Henry gestured for them to come inside. The air inside was stale, the walls lined with old photographs. One picture caught Clara's eye, a boy in a red hoodie, his face bright with laughter. "That's Samuel," Henry said, following her gaze. He was always different, quiet, but there was a darkness in him. After the fire, he blamed the world. He said it wasn't fair that he had to suffer, while others got to live. Henry sat down heavily. "I've heard the stories about that playground. I've tried to forget, but the past has a way of creeping back." He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with sorrow. "If you've seen him, it means he's chosen you. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Clara's heart pounded. "What does he want?" Henry's voice dropped to a whisper. "He wants to pull you into his world, to make you one of them." Clara left Henry's house with more questions than answers. If Samuel wanted to pull her into his world, why hadn't he done it already? What was he waiting for? As she drove home, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was simple: "Come back to play." Attached was a photo of the playground, taken in the dead of night. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The shadows were waiting for her. She could feel it. "I'm going back," she told Ethan later that night. He looked at her, like she'd lost her mind. "You can't," he said. "You don't know what they'll do to you." "I don't have a choice," she replied. "If I don't go, they'll come for me anyway." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then, I'm coming with you." Clara shook her head. "No, this is my fight." Ethan grabbed her arm, his expression fierce. "You're not doing this alone." Reluctantly, she agreed. That night, Clara and Ethan returned to the playground. The air was colder than before, the silence oppressive. They carried flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness. The playground seemed different, more alive, more malevolent. The shadows moved, even when the wind didn't. And the boy was already there, sitting on the swing, his hood hiding his face. "You came back," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Clara stepped forward, her fists clenched. "What do you want from me?" The boy tilted his head, and for the first time, Clara saw his face clearly. His eyes were endless voids, His smile stretched too wide. "I want to play," he said simply. "Forever." The shadows surged toward them, and Clara's world went black. The car's headlights barely pierced the dense fog that hung low over the deserted streets. As Clara and Ethan approached the playground, the once familiar landmarks of the town felt alien, warped by the suffocating tension in the air. Clara gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale, while Ethan sat in rigid silence, his face a mixture of fear and determination. The playground loomed ahead, shrouded in shadows that seemed to writhe and breathe with a life of their own. Clara parked the car several yards away, her heart pounding in her chest. A cold sweat dampened her back as she stepped out into the night. The chill in the air felt unnatural, biting deeper than the temperature warranted. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her resolve had solidified, but fear still gnawed at the edges of her sanity. She clutched the flashlight in her hand like a lifeline, knowing it was a feeble defense against whatever lurked in the darkness. As they approached the rusted gates, the swing chains rattled softly. Though there was no wind, the merry-go-round spun lazily, creaking with an eerie rhythm. The jungle gym cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch toward Clara and Ethan, as if beckoning them inside. The boy was there again, sitting on the same swing, his red hoodie standing out like a bloodstain against the muted tones of the playground. His face was hidden, his head bowed, but the oppressive energy radiating from him was palpable. "Samuel," Clara called out, her voice steadier than she expected. The boy slowly lifted his head. His face was pale, his eyes impossibly dark voids that seemed to pull at Clara's very soul. A faint smile played on his lips. "You came back," he said, his voice soft but echoing unnaturally, as though layered with 1,000 whispers. "What do you want from me?" Clara demanded, stepping forward, despite Ethan's warning hand on her arm. Samuel tilted his head, the smile widening. "You're like me," he said simply. "Lost. Alone. You don't belong here." Clara felt the sting of his words, but refused to falter. "I'm not like you," she said firmly. "I'm here to end this." Samuel's smile vanished. The shadows around him grew darker, denser, as if feeding off his anger. "You don't understand," he said, his voice sharp. "This is where we all belong. This is home." Without warning, the shadows lunged. They surged forward like living ink, consuming the playground in a swirling vortex of darkness. Clara and Ethan stumbled back, their flashlights flickering and dimming as the oppressive blackness swallowed the light. "Run," Ethan shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the exit. But the gates were gone. The playground had transformed into an endless labyrinth of distorted structures and shifting shadows. The ground beneath them felt unsteady, as though it were alive. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she clung to Ethan's hand. The shadows clawed at her, cold and suffocating, their touch like icy needles piercing her skin. She could hear whispers all around her, taunting, beckoning, threatening. "You can't leave," Samuel's voice echoed, impossibly loud and coming from everywhere at once. "You belong to us now." Clara turned to face the boy, who now stood in the center of the playground, his figure glowing faintly against the sea of darkness. His eyes burned with an otherworldly light and the shadows seemed to swirl around him as if he were their master. "You don't have to fight," Samuel said, his tone almost gentle. "It's easier if you let go." Clara's fear gave way to anger. She had lost Milo. She had lost her peace of mind. She refused to lose herself. "I don't belong here," she shouted, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. Samuel's expression darkened, and the shadows surged toward her with renewed ferocity. Clara raised her flashlight, its beam flickering weakly, and stepped forward. "Clara, no!" Ethan yelled. But she didn't stop. The light from the flashlight seemed to repel the shadows, forcing them to retreat slightly. Clara realized the truth. Light was their weakness. She turned to Ethan, who was fumbling with his phone. "Use the flashlight," she shouted. Ethan quickly turned on his phone's flashlight, the beam adding to Clara's. Together, they pushed back the encroaching darkness, the shadows writhing and hissing as the light touched them. But Samuel was unaffected. He stepped closer, his smile returning. "You think light will save you?" he mocked. "This isn't about light and dark. It's about what's inside you. The shadows are already there." As Samuel spoke, the ground beneath him began to shift. A black, swirling vortex opened at his feet. The shadows drawn toward it, like water draining from a sink. The playground trembled, the structures warping and bending as if being pulled into the vortex. "You can't fight it," Samuel said, his voice rising above the chaos. "This is where it ends." Clara's grip on the flashlight tightened. She felt the pull of the vortex, the shadows tugging at her like invisible hands. She turned to Ethan, whose face was pale with terror. "We have to stop him," Clara shouted over the noise. "How?" Ethan yelled back. Clara's mind raced. She remembered what Henry had said. Samuel was searching for friends, for someone to join him. He wanted connection, even in his twisted, malevolent form. She stepped forward, ignoring Ethan's protests. "Samuel," she called. "You don't have to do this." The boy froze, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "You don't have to be alone," Clara said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "You don't have to take people. You can let go." Samuel's expression flickered, a hint of vulnerability breaking through his anger. For a moment, the shadows around him seemed to waver, but the moment passed, and Samuel's face hardened. "It's too late for me," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But it's not too late for you. Join us, and you'll understand." The shadows surged forward again, and Clara braced herself. She wasn't going to let Samuel win. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the drawing, the crude illustration of the playground with the haunting message, "You're one of us now." "This isn't who I am," Clara said, holding up the drawing. "And it's not who you have to be." Samuel stared at the drawing, his expression unreadable. The shadows around him faltered, their movements growing sluggish. "You don't know what it's like," he whispered. "To be forgotten, to fade away." "I do," Clara said softly. "But this isn't the answer." The vortex grew stronger, the entire playground shaking violently. Clara felt herself being pulled toward the swirling darkness, but she didn't let go of the drawing. She held it out to Samuel, her eyes pleading. "You can end this," she said. "You are empowered to stop it." For a long moment, Samuel hesitated. The shadows writhed around him, their whispers growing louder. more, desperate. But then, slowly, he reached out and took the drawing from Clara's hand. The vortex roared, and Samuel's figure began to dissolve, the shadows pulling him toward the center. His eyes met Clara's one last time, and she saw a flicker of peace in his expression. "Thank you," he whispered. The vortex imploded, taking Samuel and the shadows with it. The playground fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting like a heavy fog. Clara and Ethan stood in stunned silence, their flashlights flickering weakly in the now still air. The playground was empty, its structures rusted and lifeless once more. Clara felt an overwhelming sense of relief, mixed with an aching sadness. Samuel was gone, but so was the darkness that had haunted her. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure he was right. As they walked back to the car, she glanced over her shoulder at the playground. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure sitting on the swing. A boy in a red hoodie, his face turned toward her. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. The night was far from over. As Clara and Ethan reached the car, a sudden chill descended, far colder than before. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural silence. Clara stopped in her tracks, a gnawing sensation creeping into her mind. It wasn't over. A whisper slithered through the air, faint yet unmistakable. "You think it's done? You think he was the only one?" Clara froze, her breath hitching. Ethan turned sharply, his flashlight scanning the empty playground. There was nothing visible, but the atmosphere had shifted. The darkness itself felt alive, pressing in on them, pulsing with malevolent intent. "Clara," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to leave. Now." Before they could take another step, the ground trembled. A deep, guttural sound rose from the earth, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The playground structures began to creak and groan, their shapes distorting unnaturally, as if something was trying to break free. From the center of the playground, where Samuel had vanished, the ground split open. Black tendrils of shadow clawed their way upward, writhing and twisting as they formed a towering figure. It was an abomination, humanoid in shape, but impossibly large, its body composed entirely of shifting darkness. Its face was an empty void, yet Clara could feel its gaze pierce her very soul. The whispers returned, now louder, overlapping, and chaotic. They spoke in a language Clara didn't understand, yet the meaning was clear. This was no ordinary shadow. This was the source, the force that had claimed Samuel and countless others before him. Ethan staggered backward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What is that?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The entity stepped forward, each movement causing the earth to quake. Its form shifted constantly, as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. When it spoke, its voice was a symphony of whispers, each word dripping with malice. Samuel was but a fragment, a vessel. "I am the truth you seek, Clara." The sound of her name from the entity's formless mouth sent a jolt of terror through Clara. It knew her. They had been watching her. Clara's grip tightened around her flashlight. She raised it, shining the beam directly at the entity. The light struck its form, causing it to recoil slightly, but it did not retreat. Instead, it laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. You think light can banish me? The entity mocked. I am older than the sun. Your feeble weapons mean nothing. Despite its taunts, Clara noticed the way the entity's edges flickered and wavered under the beam. The light didn't destroy it, but it weakened it. She exchanged a glance with Ethan, who seemed to realize the same thing. Ethan, more light, she shouted. Ethan fumbled with his phone, turning on its flashlight and aiming it at the shadowy mass. The entity roared, its form shuddering violently as the combined beams struck it. The ground beneath it cracked and splintered, black tendrils thrashing wildly as it struggled to maintain its shape. But the entity wasn't done. With a guttural growl, it lashed out, a tendril of shadow striking Ethan with bone-crushing force. He was thrown to the ground, his flashlight skittering out of reach. Ethan! Clara screamed, but she had no time to help him. Another tendril shot toward her, and she barely managed to dodge, the icy air cutting her cheek like a blade. You cannot win, the entity hissed, its voice filling Clara's mind. You are already mine. You feel it, don't you? The pull of the shadows, the darkness inside you. Clara's knees buckled under the weight of the entity's words. It was right. She had felt it. The despair, the emptiness, the sense of being lost. The same feelings that had consumed Samuel. But she refused to give in. I'm not like you, Clara said through gritted teeth, forcing herself to stand. I won't let you take me. The entity laughed again, its form towering over her. I do not need to take you. You will come willingly. I can offer you what you've lost. I can bring him back. Clara's heart stopped. Milo? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, the entity purred. Your brother. He is here, waiting. You can join him. All it takes is one step into the shadows. For a moment, Clara wavered. The thought of seeing Milo again, of holding him, was almost too much to resist. But then she remembered the drawing Samuel had given her. The twisted message scrawled across it, You're one of us now. She realized the truth. This wasn't about reuniting with Milo. It was about ensnaring her soul. No, she said firmly, her voice stronger now. You won't trap me, and you won't take anyone else. Clara picked up Ethan's flashlight, holding both beams steady as she advanced toward the entity. The light seared its form, forcing it to retreat step by step. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, but Clara pressed on. Clara, don't! Ethan called from the ground, but she didn't stop. The entity roared in fury, its tendrils thrashing wildly. You cannot destroy me. I am eternal. Clara knew she couldn't kill it, but she could weaken it, driving it back to whatever abyss it had crawled from. She reached the playground's center, where the vortex had opened, and focused the light directly at the ground. The shadows writhed and screamed, their voices merging into an ear-splitting wail. The entity's form began to dissolve, its tendrils retracting as it struggled to resist the pull of the light. Ethan, help me, Clara shouted. Ethan, battered but conscious, crawled toward the car and turned on the high beams. The sudden flood of light hit the playground, banishing the remaining shadows. The entity let out a final, deafening roar, as it was pulled into the earth, its form collapsing into nothingness. Silence fell over the playground. The oppressive energy was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Clara stood in the center, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The flashlights still clutched in her trembling hands. Ethan limped over to her, his face pale but determined. "Is it gone?" he asked. Clara looked around. The rusted structures, now lifeless and inert. She nodded slowly. For now, they made their way back to the car, the headlights casting long shadows that no longer felt threatening. As they drove away, Clara glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the boy in the red hoodie or the towering shadow. But the playground was empty. As they reached the edge of town, Clara turned to Ethan. "Do you think it's really over?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. But whatever that thing was, it won't stop looking for people like Samuel or like us." Clara's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She knew he was right. The entity was gone, but its influence lingered, waiting for the next lost soul to stumble into its web. The shadows, she realized, were everywhere. As Clara and Ethan fled the playground, the world around them began to change. The air thickened like molasses, and the streetlights that should have guided them back to safety blinked out one by one. A wave of panic gripped Clara as she realized they weren't just running from the entity. They were trapped within its domain. "We need to get out of here," Ethan shouted, limping behind her. The injury from the shadow's attack slowed him down, and Clara had to grab his arm to keep him moving. Behind them, the shadows roared to life. They weren't done. Tendrils of blackness slithered out of the playground, reaching farther than they should have, coiling like living creatures, hungry for their prey. The air was alive with the sinister symphony of whispers, their unintelligible chorus echoing in Clara's ears. "Run!" Clara screamed, dragging Ethan toward the car parked at the edge of the playground. But before they could reach it, the ground beneath their feet cracked and groaned. From the fissures, more tendrils erupted, thicker and more aggressive than before. They lashed out, forcing Clara and Ethan to dive aside. The playground itself seemed to warp and twist, the swings creaking as if being pushed by invisible hands, and the rusted merry-go-round spinning wildly on its own. One of the tendrils coiled around Ethan's leg, yanking him to the ground. He screamed, clawing at the dirt as it dragged him toward the void. Clara turned, her heart hammering in her chest, and without thinking, she grabbed a heavy flashlight and swung it at the tendril. The beam of light seared through the shadow, causing it to shriek and retreat. "Get up!" Clara yelled, pulling Ethan to his feet. "We can't stop." But the entity was far from finished. The towering shadow from before emerged once more, its form even larger and more grotesque, filling the sky like a living storm cloud. Its voice thundered, shaking the ground beneath them. "You cannot escape. The shadows claim what is theirs." Clara turned to face the monstrosity, her fear battling against a surge of defiance. She raised her flashlight again, the beam flickering but steady. "You don't own us," she shouted, her voice breaking but resolute. "We're not yours to take." The entity laughed, a hollow, guttural sound that seemed to come from every direction. "You already belong to me, Clara. You stepped into the darkness the moment you chose to search for him." Clara's mind raced. It was right. She had been drawn to the playground, not just by curiosity, but by something deeper, something darker. She thought of Samuel's haunted expression, of the pull of despair that had almost consumed her. The entity fed on that weakness, and it wanted her to give in. Clara! Ethan's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. He had managed to reach the car and was frantically waving at her. We have to go. Now. Clara nodded, backing away from the entity as its tendrils reached for her. The flashlight was her only weapon, and she swung it desperately, keeping the shadows at bay. As she ran toward the car, Ethan threw open the driver's door, sliding into the seat as Clara scrambled in beside him. The keys were already in the ignition, and he turned them with shaking hands. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. The headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the writhing tendrils that blocked their path. Clara grabbed the flashlight and aimed its beam through the windshield, focusing on the largest tendrils. They recoiled under the combined assault of light, momentarily clearing a path. Go! Clara screamed. Ethan slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward. The tires spun for a moment in the loose gravel, but then they gripped, propelling them out of the playground's cursed boundary. Behind them, the entity roared in fury, its tendrils thrashing wildly. As it tried to pull them back, the car sped down the darkened street, its headlights the only light in the suffocating blackness. But even as they put distance between themselves and the playground, the shadows didn't relent. They followed, a living storm of darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. Ethan's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. We can't outrun it, he shouted, panic rising in his voice. What do we do? Clara's mind raced. She looked around, searching for anything that could help them. That's when she saw it. A bridge up ahead, its lights still glowing faintly in the distance. A surge of hope filled her chest. The bridge! Shadows can't exist in pure light. Ethan glanced at her, his face pale but determined. Hold on. The car roared toward the bridge, the entity gaining on them. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to claw at Clara's sanity. She gritted her teeth, focusing on the lights ahead. As they reached the bridge, the car's headlights illuminated the boundary, where darkness met light. The shadows hesitated, their tendrils recoiling as if burned. The entity let out a furious roar, its form distorting and collapsing as it tried to cross the threshold. Ethan didn't slow down. The car barreled onto the bridge, the bright lights above washing over them. Clara turned to look back and saw the entity writhing at the edge of the light, unable to follow. Its form began to shrink, collapsing in on itself as the shadows dissolved into the night. When they reached the other side of the bridge, Ethan pulled over, his hands shaking as he killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their breathing heavy in the silence. Clara was the first to break it. We made it, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, staring straight ahead. But for how long? Clara followed his gaze, her eyes settling on the horizon. The playground was far behind them, but the memory of its shadows lingered, etched into her mind. She knew they weren't safe. Not completely. The entity was still out there, waiting, watching. She reached over and took Ethan's hand, her grip firm. Despite the fear that still lingered, "We'll figure it out," she said. "Whatever it takes, we'll stop it." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We have to." As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the shadows began to recede. But Clara knew better than to trust the light. The shadows weren't gone. They were just waiting. The morning light felt foreign as it washed over Clara and Ethan. They sat slumped in the car on the side of the road, the bridge glowing faintly behind them. The entity was gone, or at least they had escaped it, for now. But the weight of the night clung to them like a second skin. Ethan broke the silence first. "Do you think it's really over?" His voice was raw, laced with exhaustion and a faint glimmer of hope. Clara wanted to comfort him, to tell him they were safe, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stared at the horizon, where the first light of day began to creep into the sky. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't think it's something you can just run from." The shadows had felt too alive and patient. They weren't bound to the playground. They were tied to something deeper, something that still loomed just out of reach. Clara's thoughts turned to the whispered voices, the way they had seemed to know her, to understand her weaknesses. The entity wasn't just an external force. It had found a way inside her mind. When they finally returned to the town, it was eerily quiet. The streets, normally bustling with early risers and the hum of life, felt desolate. It seemed like the town sensed the darkness. They fled and retreated into silence. They parked in front of Clara's apartment, neither eager to leave the small cocoon of the car. Ethan's gaze was distant, his fingers twitching against the steering wheel. "I keep hearing it," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hearing what?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "The whispers," Ethan replied. He turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. "Even now, they're quiet, but they're there, like they're waiting." Clara's stomach twisted. She had heard them too, faint and fleeting, like a bad memory that wouldn't fade. She reached out and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, trying to anchor both of them. "We'll figure this out," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Together." Later that day, Clara found herself back in her apartment, the blinds drawn tight against the harsh sunlight. Ethan was resting on the couch, his breathing shallow and uneven, while she pored over her laptop. If the playground had a history, if the entity had roots, she needed to know. Hours passed as Clara scoured forums, news archives, and local history websites. Patterns began to emerge, threads of stories that mirrored their own. Disappearances around the playground dated back decades, always at night, always unexplained. Witness accounts spoke of shadows moving unnaturally, of whispers that called to people by name. One article from 20 years ago caught her attention. It detailed the disappearance of a boy named Caleb, last seen near the playground. His mother claimed he'd told her about the shadow friends he had made, about how they promised to take him to a better place. The police had dismissed her claims, chalking the incident up to a runaway child. But Clara felt the chill of recognition. She had heard those whispers too, promising escape, relief, and understanding. Her breath caught as she read the final lines of the article. "Sometimes at night, you can still hear him calling from the playground. A boy's voice, faint and pleading, but always drowned out by the laughter of something darker. By the time Clara looked up from her research, the sun had set and her apartment was bathed in shadows. She hadn't turned on any lights, too absorbed in her work, and now the dimness felt oppressive. Her heart raced as she stood and flipped the nearest switch. The lamp flickered once before bathing the room in a pale glow. "Ethan?" she called softly, but there was no response. She turned toward the couch, only to find it empty. Panic surged through her. "Ethan?" she repeated, louder this time. Soft rustling sound came from the kitchen, and she hurried toward it. She found him standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't turn to look at her. "They're out there," he said flatly. "I can see them, waiting." Clara's blood ran cold. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. His skin was icy to the touch. "Ethan, there's nothing out there," she said, though she didn't believe her own words. He finally turned to her, his face pale and his eyes haunted. "They're never going to stop, Clara. You know that, don't you? We let them in. They'll follow us forever." Clara managed to coax Ethan back to the couch, but the unease lingered. They agreed to leave town the next day, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the playground. Clara hoped it would be enough, though deep down, she wasn't sure it would make a difference. That night, she lay awake on the couch, Ethan asleep beside her. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, threading through her thoughts like poison. She closed her eyes, willing them to stop, but the darkness behind her eyelids only seemed to amplify them. "Come back. We're waiting. You belong with us." She sat up abruptly, her chest heaving. The room was silent, but the whispers had left their mark. She glanced at Ethan, his face peaceful in sleep, and wondered if he was hearing them too. As dawn approached, Clara's phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, and her stomach churned as she opened it. "You can't run from shadows. They're always with you." She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, her hands trembling. The message had no sender or traceable source. It was as if the entity itself had found a way to reach her. When Ethan woke, she didn't tell him about the message. There was no point in adding to his fear. By midday, they were on the road, their belongings hastily packed into Ethan's car. The farther they drove from the playground, the lighter the air seemed. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she half expected to see tendrils of darkness curling along the horizon. Ethan was silent for most of the drive, his eyes fixed on the road. When they finally stopped for gas, he turned to her and said, "Do you think it's enough? Leaving?" Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know, but we can't stay there. That place, it's not just a playground. It's something else. Something wrong." As they checked into a motel that night, the whispers returned, faint but insistent. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched into fists as she listened to the silence around her. The shadows in the room seemed to shift when she wasn't looking, and the air felt heavier than it should. Ethan sat beside her, his head in his hands. "We'll never get away," he said, his voice barely audible. "They'll always find us." Clara didn't respond. She didn't have the strength to argue. As they lay in the darkness, neither of them slept. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows crept closer. Somewhere in the distance, Clara thought she heard laughter, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down her spine. The next morning, they continued their journey, but the unease never left them. The shadows clung to their thoughts, their fears, and their very souls. Clara didn't know if they would ever truly escape the entity, or if it had already claimed them in ways they couldn't yet understand. But one thing was certain: the playground where shadows came to life wasn't just a place. It was a farce, a living nightmare that would haunt them forever. And it was patience